The hunger in little Sarah's cries pierced the air like a sharpened knife, cutting through the peaceful silence of the western prairie. Madeline Landon clutched her infant daughter closer to her chest, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face as she collapsed in the tall grass. 3 days without proper food had left both mother and child weak, their journey west proving far more treacherous than Madeline had ever imagined when she'd fled her former life. Wyoming Territory, 1876. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the open grassland stretching toward the horizon, where the town of Humboldt was supposedly waiting if she could just make it another 5 miles. But Madeline's strength had finally given out. Her worn boots had blistered her feet raw, and the meager supplies she'd managed to bring had run out yesterday. Now, as she lay in the grass with her crying infant, she wondered if she'd made the most terrible mistake of her life. "Hush now, sweet girl," she whispered, though her parched throat made the words come out as little more than a rasp. "Mama's here. We're going to be all right." But Sarah's hunger cries only intensified, and Madeline felt the crushing weight of failure pressing down on her chest. At 23, she was alone in the world with a 6-month-old daughter, running from a past that threatened to swallow them both. The sound of hoofbeats in the distance barely registered until they grew louder, approaching rapidly from the east. Madeline tried to push herself upright, panic surging through her veins. Out here, alone and defenseless, a stranger could mean salvation or destruction. She had heard enough stories about the dangers women faced traveling alone to know better than to trust easily. The rider appeared over a small rise, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, tall and broad-shouldered atop a chestnut stallion. As he drew closer, Madeline could make out the details: worn denims, a weathered hat pulled low, and a revolver holstered at his hip. A cowboy by the looks of him, though whether friend or foe remained to be seen. The man reined his horse to a stop about 20 paces away, studying the scene before him. Sarah's cries had grown weaker now, which frightened Madeline more than the stranger's presence. "Madam." The cowboy's voice carried across the distance between them, deep but not threatening. Madeline tried to stand again, determined to appear stronger than she felt, but her legs trembled and gave way beneath her. "Please," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. "My baby." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and approached cautiously, hands visible at his sides in a gesture that was clearly meant to reassure her he intended no harm. As he drew closer, Madeline could see his features more clearly. A strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble, sun-weathered skin, and eyes that reminded her of the clear summer sky back in Pennsylvania. "Madam, you all right?" he asked, though the answer was plainly obvious. Madeline shook her head, unable to summon the energy for pretense. "My baby's hungry. We haven't eaten properly in days." The man knelt down beside them, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the temples. He studied the infant with genuine concern, then looked back at Madeline. "Zachariah Flynn," he said by way of introduction. "Most folks call me Zach. I've got a ranch about 3 miles west of here." Sarah's cries had subsided to whimpers, her tiny body exhausted from the effort. Without hesitation, Zach unbuttoned his coat and slipped it off, laying it on the grass. Then, with surprising gentleness for hands so large and calloused, he reached for the baby. "May I?" he asked, his voice soft. Too weak to protest, and seeing nothing but kindness in his eyes, Madeline nodded. Zach carefully lifted Sarah from her arms and placed her on his coat, checking her small form with evident concern. "She's dehydrated," he said, his brow furrowed, "and so are you by the looks of it." He reached for his canteen, uncorking it before offering it to Madeline. "Small sips," he instructed. "Too much at once will make you sick." The water was cool against her parched throat, and Madeline had to force herself to follow his instructions rather than gulp it down greedily. As she drank, Zach rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a small jar. "It's applesauce," he explained. "Not much, but it might help the little one until we can get you both properly fed." He dipped his finger into the jar and gently touched it to Sarah's lips. The baby instinctively began to suckle, her cries momentarily silenced by the sweet substance. "There we go," he murmured, continuing to feed her tiny amounts. That's a good girl. Madeline watched through tear-filled eyes as this stranger cared for her daughter with such tenderness. Thank you, she whispered, the words wholly inadequate for what she felt. Zach glanced up at her, his expression serious. You can't stay out here. My ranch is closest. I can take you both there, get you fed and rested before you continue on to wherever you're headed. Under normal circumstances, Madeline would never have considered accepting such an offer from a man she'd just met. But these were not normal circumstances, and her daughter's survival outweighed all other concerns. Humboldt, she said. I was trying to reach Humboldt, Zach nodded. That's another 5 miles past my place. He carefully gathered Sarah in his coat, cradling her against his chest with one arm. Can you stand, madam? I don't mean to press, but we should get moving before sunset. With his free hand, he helped Madeline to her feet. Her legs trembled beneath her and she swayed dangerously. Without comment, Zach swept her up with his free arm, managing somehow to hold both mother and child as he walked back to his horse. I'm going to put you up first, he said, helping her into the saddle, then hand you the baby. Once they were both settled, Zach took the reins and began leading the horse on foot, setting a steady pace westward. I don't even know your name, madam, he said after they'd been walking for several minutes. Madeline, she replied, her voice stronger after the water. Madeline Landon. And this is Sarah. Well, Miss Landon, Mrs., she corrected automatically, then felt a wave of shame wash over her. At least I was. Zach didn't press for details, for which Madeline was grateful. Mrs. Landon, then, will be at my place in about an hour. It's not much, but it's dry and warm, and there's plenty of food. As they traveled, the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the vast Wyoming sky in hues of orange and pink. Despite her exhaustion, Madeline found herself studying her rescuer as he walked steadily ahead, leading the horse with sure hands. There was something about his quiet strength that reassured her in ways words could not. The Flynn Ranch came into view just as the last rays of sunlight were fading from the sky, a modest cabin with a barn and corral set against the backdrop of distant mountains. It wasn't large or grand, but to Madeline's weary eyes, it looked like paradise. Home, Zach said simply as they approached. Let me help you down. He lifted her from the saddle with ease, supporting her weight as her legs threatened to buckle beneath her again. Sarah had fallen asleep, still wrapped in Zach's coat, her tiny face peaceful for the first time in days. The interior of the cabin was neat but sparsely furnished, a table with 4 chairs, a cast iron stove, a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, and a bed in the corner. A colorful quilt provided the only real decoration. You can take the bed, Zach said, helping Madeline to sit on the edge of it. I'll sleep in the chair by the fire. I couldn't possibly, Madeline began to protest, but Zach cut her off gently. You need proper rest, and so does your daughter, I insist. He placed Sarah carefully on the bed beside Madeline, then moved to the stove, where he quickly built a fire and set a pot of water to boil. I've got some stew left from yesterday, he said, moving with efficient purpose around the small space. And I can make up some milk for the little one. It's goat's milk, not cow's, but it should do for now. As he worked, Madeline found herself studying his movements, the way his hands, rough from ranch work, could be so gentle as they prepared food for her and her child. There was a quiet dignity about him that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin, untroubled by the need to prove himself to others. May I ask what brings you to Wyoming Territory, Mrs. Landon? Zach finally asked as he placed a steaming bowl of stew before her. It's a hard journey for a woman alone, especially with a baby. Madeline hesitated, the spoonful of stew paused halfway to her mouth. How much could she tell this stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness? The truth was ugly and complicated, but she owed him some explanation. I'm running, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. My husband, he died 6 months ago, just after Sarah was born. His brother decided that meant he had some claim on both me and the family property. She swallowed hard. He wasn't a kind man. When he threatened to take Sarah if I didn't marry him, I fled. Zach's expression darkened, though his voice remained even. You did right to protect your child. No one should force a woman into such a choice. He'll be looking for us, Madeline continued, the fear evident in her voice. That's why I came west. I have a cousin in Humboldt, my mother's sister's daughter. She married a shopkeeper there last year. I'm hoping she can help us start over. Zach nodded thoughtfully. Humboldt's a good town, growing fast but still decent folk for the most part. He hesitated. If your cousin can't help, you should know there's work to be had there. The hotel's always looking for help, and so is the dress shop. Thank you, Madeline said, genuinely touched by his concern. You've already done more for us than I had any right to expect from a stranger. Out here, helping others isn't kindness, it's survival, Zach replied simply. I wouldn't be here myself if others hadn't helped me when I needed it. As they ate, Zach told her a little about himself, how he'd come west after the war with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, worked cattle drives for years, before saving enough to buy this small parcel of land 3 years ago. He was 31, had never married, and seemed content with his solitary life. Though Madeline sensed there were depths to his story he wasn't sharing, when they finished eating, Zach showed her where she could wash up, providing a basin of warm water and a clean towel. He even produced a small wooden crate that, with a blanket inside, would serve as a makeshift crib for Sarah. I made this thinking someday I might have a family, he explained somewhat sheepishly. Never got around to finding a wife, but I suppose it's coming in handy now. That night, as Madeline lay in Zach's bed with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her crate beside her, she found herself staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of her rescuer moving about the cabin, banking the fire for the night. For the first time in months, she felt safe, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it. Tomorrow, they would continue to Humboldt, and this brief interlude would end. But for tonight, in this quiet cabin on the Wyoming frontier, Madeline allowed herself to breathe freely and dream of possibilities she'd thought forever lost. The morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows. Madeline woke to find Sarah already awake but content, making soft cooing sounds instead of her usual hungry cries. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon filled the cabin, and she turned to see Zach at the stove, his back to her as he worked. Good morning, she said softly, sitting up and smoothing her tangled hair with her fingers. Zach turned, a smile warming his face. Good morning. How's the little one doing? Much better, thanks to you. Madeline lifted Sarah from her makeshift crib, marveling at how different her daughter seemed after just one night of proper care, her cheeks already regaining some of their healthy color. I've warmed some milk for her, Zach said, gesturing to a small pot on the stove. And there's breakfast for you when you're ready. As they ate, Madeline found herself reluctant to bring up the journey to Humboldt, though she knew they couldn't impose on Zach's hospitality indefinitely. To her surprise, it was he who broached the subject. I've been thinking, he began, a hint of hesitation in his voice. The trail to Humboldt crosses Miller's Creek, and with the spring melt it might be running high. It would be safer if I rode with you, at least as far as the town. Relief flooded through Madeline. The prospect of continuing alone had been weighing heavily on her mind. That's very kind of you, Mr. Flynn. I don't want to take you away from your work, Zach, please, he corrected gently. And it's no trouble. The cattle won't miss me for a day. They set out mid-morning, with Sarah securely bundled against Madeline's chest and their few possessions packed in Zach's saddlebags. This time, Zach rode behind Madeline, one arm loosely around her waist to steady her, the other holding the reins. The closeness was intimate in a way that would have been scandalous back east, but out here in the vast openness of Wyoming, such concerns seemed trivial compared to practical matters of safety and comfort. As they rode, Zach pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area where a herd of wild mustangs could sometimes be spotted, which creek had the best fishing, how the mountains in the distance looked purple at sunset. His deep voice rumbled against Madeline's back as he spoke, and she found herself relaxing into his solid presence. How long have you been on your own? He asked during a brief stop to rest the horse and feed Sarah. Madeline considered the question. Thomas, my husband, died last October. Sarah was just 3 weeks old, she swallowed, the memory still painful. He got thrown from a horse. The doctor said his neck broke instantly. Zach nodded solemnly. I'm sorry, that's a hard thing, losing someone so suddenly. It was, Madeline agreed. But it was his brother, Victor, who made it unbearable. He moved into our house before Thomas was even in the ground, claimed it was his right as the elder brother to take care of us. But all he really wanted was the land Thomas had inherited. Her voice hardened. By December, he was pressuring me to marry him. Said it would keep everything in the family. When I refused, things got difficult. By March, he'd begun threatening to take Sarah away, claiming I was unfit. That's when I knew we had to leave. Zach's expression had darkened as she spoke, his jaw tight with restrained anger. No man has the right to threaten a mother with her child, he said, the words clipped. You were brave to leave. Not brave, Madeline corrected quietly. Desperate, there's a difference. Sometimes they look the same, Zach replied, his blue eyes meeting hers with an understanding that went beyond words. They continued their journey, crossing Miller's Creek without incident despite the spring current running strong. By mid-afternoon, they crested a rise that revealed Humboldt spread out before them in the valley below a town of perhaps 50 buildings arranged along a main street, with smaller structures dotting the surrounding area. There it is, Zach said, reining the horse to a stop. Humboldt. Growing every year since the railroad came through. Madeline stared at the town, her destination for so many weeks now suddenly real before her. Uncertainty twisted in her stomach. What if her cousin wasn't there? What if she wouldn't or couldn't help? As if sensing her thoughts, Zach's arm tightened slightly around her waist. It'll be all right, he said quietly. If your cousin can't help, there are other good people in town. The minister, Reverend Harper, helps folks get settled, and Mrs. Peterson at the hotel is always looking for reliable help. His confident tone steadied her, and Madeline nodded. Thank you, Zach, for everything. They rode down into town, the horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust on the main street. Humboldt was busy for its size, with wagons and riders moving about, shoppers entering and exiting the various businesses, and a general air of purpose and industry. Compared to the isolation of the trail, it was almost overwhelming. Your cousin, Zach said as they made their way down the street. What's her name and her husband's? Rebecca and Daniel Wright, Madeline replied. He's a shopkeeper, though I'm not sure what kind. Zach nodded. Wright's general store on the corner there. He pointed to a 2-story building at the far end of the main street. Been there about a year if it's the same Wright. Hope surged in Madeline's chest. They were here. Her plan hadn't been in vain. As they approached the store, a bell jingled over the door and a woman stepped out slender, with honey blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a bonnet. She turned and Madeline felt tears spring to her eyes. Rebecca, older than she remembered, more mature in the face but unmistakably her cousin. Rebecca, she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. The woman turned, confusion crossing her features before recognition dawned. Madeline. Madeline Landon, is that really you? Zach helped Madeline down from the horse, steadying her as she took a step toward her cousin. Rebecca rushed forward, stopping short when she noticed Sarah bundled against Madeline's chest. Oh my goodness, she breathed. Is this? My daughter, Sarah, Madeline confirmed, carefully shifting the baby so Rebecca could see her face. She's 6 months old now, Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Thomas's child, I heard about his passing. I'm so sorry, Maddie. She looked up, seeming to notice Zach for the first time. And who is this gentleman? Zachariah Flynn, Zach introduced himself, tipping his hat. I found Mrs. Landon and her daughter out on the prairie yesterday in some distress. Thought it best to see them safely to town. Rebecca's eyes widened with concern. Distress, Madeline, what happened? Why are you here? The story came pouring out, then Thomas's death, Victor's increasingly threatening behavior, and Madeline's desperate flight west with her infant daughter. As she spoke, they moved inside the store where Daniel Wright, a friendly-faced man with a neatly trimmed beard, listened with growing concern. You'll stay with us, of course, Rebecca declared when Madeline had finished. We have a room upstairs that's hardly used. It's small, but it will do until you find your feet. I couldn't impose, Madeline began, but Daniel cut her off gently. Family is never an imposition, Mrs. Landon. Rebecca has spoken of you often. We'd be honored to help. Relief washed over Madeline in a wave so powerful she nearly swayed on her feet. Zach's hand appeared at her elbow, steadying her again. Thank you, she whispered, looking between her cousin and Zach. Both of you, all of you, I don't know what would have happened if. But it didn't, Zach said firmly. You're safe now, and that's what matters. There was a moment of awkward silence as they all recognized that this was where their paths would diverge. Zach cleared his throat. Well, I should be getting back to the ranch before dark, Mrs. Landon. It was a pleasure making your acquaintance, difficult circumstances aside. Wait, Madeline said impulsively, reaching for his hand. You rode all this way, at least stay for supper before you head back. Rebecca immediately seconded the invitation. Yes, please do, Mr. Flynn. It's the least we can offer for your kindness to my cousin. Zach hesitated, his blue eyes meeting Madeline's for a long moment. I suppose the cattle can wait a bit longer, he conceded with a small smile. That evening, they shared a meal in the Wrights' comfortable apartment above the store. The conversation flowed easily, with Rebecca and Daniel eager to hear about Madeline's journey and Zach's life on his ranch. Sarah, well-fed and content, was passed from arms to arms, cooed over by everyone, especially Rebecca, who confided that she and Daniel were hoping to start a family of their own soon. As the evening drew to a close, Zach rose reluctantly to take his leave. I really should be getting back, he said, reaching for his hat. It's a fair ride, and I've got chores waiting at dawn. Madeline walked with him down to the street where his horse was hitched. The spring night was cool but clear, with stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, neither quite knowing how to say goodbye. I can never thank you enough, Madeline finally said, looking up at him. You saved our lives, Zach. He ducked his head, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. Not anyone, what you did, she broke off, emotion making her voice unsteady. Just, thank you. Zach looked at her then, his expression serious in the gathering darkness. Will you be all right here? Truly, Madeline nodded. Rebecca and Daniel are good people, we'll be fine. And if your brother-in-law comes looking, the question sent a chill through her, but Madeline squared her shoulders. He'd have to find us first, and even if he did, I won't let him take Sarah. Not ever. Zach smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. That's the spirit, Mrs. Landon. He hesitated, then added, if you need anything at all, my ranch is just 5 miles west, the Broken Arrow, it's called. I'll remember, she promised. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle and gathering the reins. Goodbye, Madeline, he said softly, using her first name for the first time. Goodbye, Zach, she replied, surprised by the tightness in her throat. Ride safe. With a tip of his hat and a final look that seemed to hold words unspoken, Zach turned his horse and rode out of town, his figure gradually swallowed by the gathering darkness. Madeline stood watching long after he had disappeared from view, a curious emptiness settling in her chest. It was foolish, she knew, to feel such a connection to a man she'd known for barely 2 days. Yet as she finally turned to go back inside, she couldn't help glancing once more in the direction he had gone, wondering if their paths would ever cross again. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment for Madeline and Sarah. The Wrights were as good as their word, providing them with a small but comfortable room and welcoming them into their household as family. Daniel offered Madeline work in the store, which she gratefully accepted, determined not to be a burden. Humboldt proved to be a friendly community, if somewhat curious about the young widow and her baby. Rebecca had explained their presence simply that Madeline was her widowed cousin come west for a fresh start, and most people accepted this without question. A few cast speculative glances at the lack of a wedding ring, sold months ago to fund her journey, but the respectability of the Wrights largely shielded her from gossip. Sarah thrived in their new environment, growing stronger each day. She was sitting up now, babbling constantly and showing interest in solid foods. Rebecca doted on her, often watching the baby while Madeline worked in the store. Yet despite the warmth of their welcome and the growing security of her position, Madeline found her thoughts frequently drifting to a small ranch 5 miles west of town. She wondered how Zach was faring, whether his cattle were healthy, if he still ate his meals alone. Sometimes, when a tall, broad-shouldered man entered the store, her heart would leap, only to fall again when the face beneath the hat was not his. "You know, he comes to town every few weeks for supplies," Rebecca commented one evening as they sat mending by lamplight after Sarah had been put to bed. "Who does?" Madeline asked, feigning ignorance though her suddenly racing pulse betrayed her. Rebecca gave her a knowing look. "Mr. Flynn, of course. The way you watch the door every time the bell rings, I'd have to be blind not to notice." Madeline felt heat rising to her cheeks. "He was very kind to us. It's natural I'd wonder how he's doing." Hum, Rebecca hummed, not pressing the point but clearly unconvinced. After a moment, she added more gently, "It wouldn't be inappropriate, you know. It's been 8 months since Thomas passed. No one would think ill of you for forming new attachments." "It's not that simple," Madeline sighed, setting down her mending. "I have Sarah to consider. And we barely know each other." "Getting to know someone better generally requires seeing them again," Rebecca pointed out with a smile. "And from what little I've observed and heard around town, Mr. Flynn seems to be a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but honest in his dealings and respected." Madeline didn't respond, though her cousin's words echoed her own assessment of Zach's character. Still, the idea of actively seeking him out seemed too forward, too presumptuous. What if he had merely been being kind? What if he had no interest in a widow with a baby, the complications they would bring to his solitary life? The opportunity to find out came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, the bell above the store door jingled, and Madeline looked up from arranging a display of canned goods to find Zach standing in the entrance, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncertain. "Mr. Flynn," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Welcome to Wright's General Store." His eyes found hers immediately, and the smile that spread across his face sent a rush of warmth through her. "Mrs. Landon, it's good to see you again." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the busy store seemed to fade around them, then Daniel's voice broke the spell. "Zach." "Good to see you. Come for your usual supplies." Zach turned, nodding to Daniel, who had emerged from the back room. "Yes, and perhaps a few extra items today." As he shopped, Madeline tried to focus on her work, but she was acutely aware of his presence, the way he moved through the store with unhurried purpose, occasionally glancing her way. When he brought his selections to the counter, she couldn't help noticing they included several items not typically on a bachelor rancher's list: a small jar of honey, a packet of peppermint candies, and a length of pale blue ribbon. "How is Sarah?" he asked as Daniel tallied his purchases. "Growing stronger every day," Madeline replied with a smile. "She's trying to crawl now, though she mostly ends up scooting backward." Zach chuckled, the sound warming her more than it should have. "Sounds like progress to me, and you, are you settling in all right?" "Yes, thanks to Rebecca and Daniel, everyone has been very welcoming." There was a pause, and Madeline sensed Zach gathering himself for something. Daniel, with a discretion she would later thank him for, murmured something about checking inventory and disappeared into the back room. "Mrs. Landon, Madeline," Zach began, his voice low. "I was wondering if you might consider joining me for Sunday dinner tomorrow, at Widow Carson's boarding house," he added quickly. "They serve a fine meal after church, if you're not otherwise engaged, that is." The invitation was so unexpected that Madeline momentarily lost the power of speech. Zach's confidence seemed to waver in the face of her silence. "Of course, if it's too soon or inappropriate, no," Madeline interrupted, finding her voice at last. "I mean, yes, I would like that very much." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Wonderful. Shall I call for you around noon, after the service?" "That would be perfect," she agreed, aware that her own smile probably mirrored his in intensity. Zach paid for his purchases, tipped his hat to her with a warmth that made her cheeks flush, and departed the store. The moment he was gone, Rebecca emerged from wherever she'd been hiding, her expression triumphant. I told you he comes to town for supplies, she said, failing completely to suppress her grin. Madeline laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. You're impossible, and you were eavesdropping. Naturally, Rebecca agreed shamelessly. Now, what are you going to wear tomorrow? That blue dress brings out your eyes, and with your hair up in that style you wore for Easter, Rebecca, Madeline protested, though she was already mentally inventorying her limited wardrobe. It's just dinner. It's a beginning, her cousin corrected softly, squeezing her hand. And beginnings are precious things. Sunday dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day. Madeline attended church with the Wrights, finding the simple service comforting in its familiarity. She noticed Zach seated near the back, his tall frame easy to spot among the congregation. When their eyes met briefly during a hymn, the small nod he gave her felt more meaningful than any elaborate gesture could have been. True to his word, he appeared at the Wrights' door promptly at noon, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt with his usual denims. Sarah, who was being watched by Rebecca for the afternoon, seemed fascinated by him, reaching out to grab at his fingers when he greeted her. She remembers you, Madeline said, surprised and touched by her daughter's reaction. Smart girl, Zach replied with a gentle smile, letting Sarah grip his thumb. Takes after her mother, I'd wager. The walk to Widow Carson's boarding house was short but pleasant, with Zach politely offering his arm and Madeline just as politely accepting it. The contact, minimal though it was, sent a flutter of awareness through her that she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Widow Carson's Sunday dinner lived up to its reputation: fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh spring vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. The dining room was filled with other townspeople, many of whom greeted Zach with friendly familiarity and Madeline with curious interest. Their conversation flowed more easily than Madeline had anticipated, moving from Sarah's progress to life in Humboldt, from Zach's ranch to books they had both read. She discovered he had a keen mind behind his quiet exterior, with thoughtful opinions on everything from cattle breeding to poetry. When she mentioned her love of Tennyson, his eyes lit up. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all," he quoted softly. "I've always found comfort in that line." "You've lost someone?" Madeline asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that was forward of me," but Zach didn't seem offended. "My parents, when I was 16, influenza took them both within a week of each other, and later, during the war." He trailed off, a shadow crossing his face. "Let's just say I understand grief's company." Madeline reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. "I'm sorry." He turned his hand over, capturing her fingers in a gentle grasp before releasing them. "Life goes on, we endure, and sometimes, if we're fortunate, we find new reasons to do more than merely endure." The look in his eyes as he spoke made her heart quicken. There was something happening between them, something tentative and fragile but undeniably real. It both thrilled and frightened her. After dinner, they walked slowly back toward the Wright store, neither seeming in a hurry for the afternoon to end. The main street was quiet on Sunday, most businesses closed and families at home enjoying their day of rest. "Would you like to see the schoolhouse?" Zach suggested as they passed the white clapboard building at the edge of town. "Humboldt's quite proud of it, built just last year with donations from every family in the area." Madeline nodded, curious. "I'd like that. Sarah will be attending someday, after all." The thought of staying in Humboldt long enough for Sarah to attend school of putting down roots here was still new, but increasingly appealing. The schoolhouse was simple but well constructed, with large windows to let in light and rows of desks facing a teacher's desk and blackboard. As they stood in the empty classroom, Madeline found herself imagining Sarah older, sitting at one of these desks, learning her letters and numbers. "The teacher, Miss Wilson, is strict but fair," Zach commented, running a hand along one of the desks. "The children respect her. And she allows the older girls to bring their younger siblings on occasion, so the little ones get used to the idea of school before they start." "You seem to know a lot about it," Madeline observed. Zach looked slightly embarrassed. "I helped build it, and I try to stay involved where I can." "I believe education is important," especially out here where opportunities can be limited. Another piece of the puzzle that was Zachariah Flynn fell into place in Madeline's mind. This wasn't just a solitary rancher content with his isolation, this was a man who cared about his community, who looked to the future. As they left the schoolhouse, Zach offered his arm again, and this time when Madeline took it, she allowed herself to stand a little closer than strictly necessary. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. "Madeline," Zach said finally, his voice serious, "I hope you know that my interest in seeing you today wasn't merely out of concern for your welfare." She looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. "Oh." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "I find myself thinking about you and Sarah far more often than I can account for as simple neighborly concern. I know it's soon and that your circumstances are complicated, but I wanted to be honest about my feelings." Madeline took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I think about you too," she admitted softly. "More than I probably should." The smile that transformed his face made her glad she'd been brave enough to say the words. "Then perhaps," he said, "you wouldn't object to my calling on you again." "Properly with Rebecca and Daniel's blessing?" "I would like that very much," Madeline replied, returning his smile with one of her own, and so began a careful, intentional courtship. Zach came to town every Sunday after church, sometimes taking Madeline for walks, other times joining the Wrights for family dinner. As spring deepened into summer, he began to include Sarah in their outings, delighting in the baby's growing personality and mobility. By July, Sarah was crawling in earnest and pulling herself up on furniture, babbling constantly in her own language. She showed no shyness with Zach, reaching for him eagerly whenever he appeared. For his part, Zach seemed genuinely enchanted by her, bringing small gifts, a wooden rattle he had carved himself, a soft cloth doll from the general store, and spending hours on the floor of the Wrights' parlor, helping her practice her newfound skills. Watching them together, Madeline felt both joy and a protective caution. Sarah had never known her father. Thomas had died before she was old enough to form memories. The bond she was forming with Zach was precious, but Madeline worried about what would happen if things between her and Zach didn't work out. Sarah had already lost so much, she couldn't bear for her daughter to experience another loss. Rebecca, ever perceptive, noticed her concern one afternoon as they watched Zach teaching Sarah to stack wooden blocks, only to laugh delightedly when she knocked them down again. "He's good with her," Rebecca commented quietly. "Natural, like he's been around children all his life." "Yes," Madeline agreed, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "Perhaps too good." Rebecca gave her a searching look. "You're afraid she's becoming attached. She's so young, she doesn't understand that he's not." Madeline couldn't finish the sentence, not her father. Rebecca supplied gently. "But he could be, Maddie. I see the way he looks at both of you. This isn't just about courting you, he cares for Sarah as his own already." The observation struck Madeline to her core because she knew it was true. Zach never treated Sarah as an obligation or an obstacle to be overcome in his pursuit of Madeline. From that first day in the prairie grass, he had seen mother and child as a unit, offering his care to both with equal sincerity. That evening, after Sarah had been put to bed and the Wrights had tactfully retired early, leaving Madeline and Zach alone in the parlor, she found the courage to broach the subject. "Zach," she began, setting aside her sewing, "may I ask you something rather personal?" He looked up from the book he'd been reading, his expression open. "Of course. Why did you never marry? Before, I mean." The question had been on her mind for some time. At 31, with his own ranch and obvious good qualities, it seemed strange that no woman had claimed him. Zach closed his book, considering the question with the thoughtfulness she had come to expect from him. "I came back from the war, changed," he said finally. "Not wounded in body like some, but in spirit, I suppose you could say. I'd seen too much, done too much. Didn't feel fit company for anyone, least of all a wife." He paused, his gaze distant. "By the time I started feeling human again, I was working cattle drives, always moving. Then, when I finally got the ranch, I was too busy establishing it to think much about courting." He looked at her directly then, his blue eyes serious. "But if you're really asking whether I've thought about marriage and family, yes, I have. It's why I built a cabin with room to grow, why I made that cradle you saw. I just hadn't met the right woman, until now." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, neither ready to address it directly but both acknowledging its presence. "And Sarah?" Madeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's not yours. She comes with complications, history." "Sarah," Zach said firmly, "is a blessing. A child to be treasured for exactly who she is, not for whose blood runs in her veins." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I know what it is to lose parents, Madeline. I would never, ever do anything to cause that child pain, including making promises to her or to you that I couldn't keep." Tears welled in Madeline's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "She's becoming attached to you, we both are." Zach moved from his chair to the sofa beside her, taking her hands in his. "Good," he said simply, "because I'm thoroughly attached to both of you as well." They sat like that for a long moment, hands linked, the future stretching before them with possibilities neither had dared hope for just months ago. "I should go," Zach said finally, reluctantly releasing her hands. "It's getting late, and Daniel will be locking up soon." As always, he was mindful of propriety, careful not to give anyone reason to gossip about their relationship. It was another quality Madeline had come to appreciate about him, his respect not just for her, but for her reputation and standing in the community. At the door he paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "May I?" he asked softly, his intention clear. Madeline nodded, her heart hammering in her chest as Zach bent his head to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, his lips warm against hers for just a moment before he pulled back, searching her face. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," he admitted, his voice husky. "I've wanted you to," she confessed in return, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks despite her boldness. He smiled then, a slow smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Good night, Madeline. I'll see you Sunday." "Good night, Zach." As she watched him walk away down the street, Madeline touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt not just safe or content, but truly happy, as if the future held promises worth looking forward to rather than just dangers to be avoided. That happiness was tested the following week when a stranger arrived in Humboldt, asking questions at the hotel and various businesses. Tall, well-dressed in Eastern fashion, with a manner that was polite but somehow cold, he drew attention immediately in the small town. It was Mrs. Peterson from the hotel who brought the news to Madeline, slipping into the store while Daniel was helping a customer and Rebecca was upstairs with Sarah. "Mrs. Landon," she said in a low voice, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "There's a gentleman at the hotel asking about a young widow with a baby. Says he's looking for his brother's wife who ran off without proper cause. Thought you should know." Madeline felt the blood drain from her face. "Did he give his name?" "Victor Landon," Mrs. Peterson replied grimly. "I didn't tell him anything, of course, said I didn't know of any such person, but Humboldt's not that big and someone's bound to mention you eventually." "Thank you," Madeline managed to say through her suddenly dry throat. "I appreciate the warning." The moment Mrs. Peterson left, Madeline hurried to find Daniel, explaining the situation in urgent whispers. His normally genial expression hardened as she spoke. "We'll need to get word to Zach," he said immediately. "And you and Sarah should stay out of sight until we figure this out. Go upstairs now, and I'll send Rebecca to you. I'll close the store early and ride out to the Broken Arrow." Madeline spent the rest of the day in the upstairs apartment, pacing anxiously while trying to keep Sarah distracted and happy. The baby, sensing her mother's distress, was unusually fussy, refusing to nap and crying at the slightest provocation. Rebecca did her best to help, but her own fear was evident. "What does he want, Maddie? After all this time?" "Control," Madeline replied grimly. "The land, primarily. But he's the type of man who doesn't like to lose what he considers his. And in his mind, Thomas's property, including his wife and child, belongs to him now." "He has no legal claim," Rebecca protested. "Surely the law back east favored him," Madeline interrupted. He had influence with the local judge, and without Thomas I had little standing. That's why I ran. I couldn't fight him there, not and win. The sound of horses outside drew them to the window. Daniel had returned, and with him was Zach, both men dismounting with purposeful haste. Moments later they heard footsteps on the stairs, and then both men were in the apartment, Zach's expression a mixture of concern and carefully contained anger. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately, crossing to Madeline and taking her hands in his. His eyes searched her face, then moved to Sarah, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes from her place on a blanket on the floor. "We're fine," Madeline assured him. "He hasn't found us yet, and he won't," Zach said firmly. "Daniel's told me everything. This man, your brother-in-law, he has no claim on you here. Wyoming Territory isn't Pennsylvania." "But he'll try," Madeline said, fear making her voice shake. "Victor doesn't give up easily, and he can be persuasive." Zach's jaw tightened. "Let him try. You're not alone anymore, Madeline." Daniel cleared his throat. "I've been thinking. The simplest solution would be for you and Sarah to stay at Zach's ranch for a few days. It's isolated, and no one in town knows exactly where it is except me and a few others who wouldn't talk." "That's right," Zach agreed. "He'd have no way of finding you there. And by the time he gives up and leaves town, we can have made more permanent arrangements." Madeline looked between the two men, grateful for their protection but hesitant about the impropriety of staying at Zach's ranch unchaperoned. As if reading her thoughts, Rebecca spoke up. "I'll go with them," she said firmly. "Daniel can manage the store for a few days, and that way everything will be proper." The plan was quickly agreed upon. They would wait until nightfall, then slip out the back of the store and take the wagon Zach had brought, traveling to the Broken Arrow under cover of darkness. In the meantime, Daniel would return to the store to maintain appearances, while Zach and Rebecca helped Madeline pack what they would need for several days away. As they worked, Madeline found herself fighting tears of frustration and fear. Just when she had begun to feel secure, to believe that a new life was possible, her past had caught up with her. What if Victor didn't give up? What if he somehow found them at the ranch? What if, hey, Zach's gentle voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. He had entered the small bedroom where she was packing clothes for Sarah and found her staring blankly at the wall. "It's going to be all right." "You can't know that," she said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "You don't know Victor. He's determined and he has resources." "So are we," Zach replied, crossing to stand before her. "Determined, that is, and maybe our resources aren't as grand as his, but we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" "Community," Zach said simply. "People who care about you and Sarah. People who won't let anything happen to either of you." His confidence steadied her, as it had that first day when he'd found them in the grass. Madeline took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right, I'm sorry for doubting." "Don't apologize for being afraid," Zach said, his expression serious. "Fear keeps us alive sometimes, but don't let it rule you either. We'll get through this, together." The word "together" resonated through her with unexpected force. This man, who had entered her life by chance just months ago, was now standing with her against the threat that had driven her across half a continent. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. In that moment, Madeline knew with absolute certainty that she loved him. The realization should have frightened her, given their relatively brief acquaintance, but instead it filled her with a calm resolve. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Nightfall brought a new tension as they prepared to leave. Daniel had returned with news that Victor Landon was still making inquiries around town, growing increasingly impatient with the lack of information. He had taken a room at the hotel and announced his intention to stay as long as necessary to find his missing sister-in-law. They slipped out the back door of the store around 10 o'clock, when most of Humboldt was already abed. Zach had brought his wagon, the bed layered with straw and blankets to make the journey more comfortable. He helped Madeline up first, passing a sleepy Sarah to her before assisting Rebecca. Then, with a final low-voiced exchange with Daniel, he climbed up to the driver's seat and set the horses in motion. They traveled in silence for the first mile, wary of being overheard. Once they were well clear of town, Zach spoke quietly over his shoulder. "It's about an hour to the ranch." Try to get some rest if you can." Madeline doubted she could sleep, but the rhythmic sway of the wagon and Sarah's warm weight against her chest eventually lulled her into a light doze. She woke with a start when the wagon came to a stop, momentarily disoriented, until Zach's voice came through the darkness. "We're here. Welcome to the Broken Arrow." In the moonlight, Madeline could make out the silhouette of the cabin she remembered from that first day, with the barn and corral beyond. But there were changes too. A garden now flourished to one side, fenced to keep out deer, and she could see what looked like new construction extending from the back of the cabin. "You've been building," she observed as Zach helped her down from the wagon. "Just a room," he said, a note of self-consciousness in his voice. "Thought it might be useful someday." Rebecca, who had remained fully awake and alert throughout the journey, looked between them with barely concealed amusement despite the seriousness of their situation. "Well, it's certainly useful tonight. Shall we go in? I'm half frozen." The interior of the cabin was as Madeline remembered it: neat, masculine in its simplicity, but welcoming. A fire was quickly lit in the stove, and Zach showed them to the sleeping arrangements he had hastily prepared. The new room, still smelling of fresh cut lumber, contained a narrow bed that would serve for Rebecca. Madeline and Sarah would take Zach's bed while he would sleep on a bedroll by the stove. "It's not fancy," he apologized, "but it's safe. No one will find you here." "It's perfect," Madeline assured him. "Thank you, Zach, for everything." Once Sarah was settled in the makeshift crib Zach had kept and Rebecca had retired to the new room, Madeline found herself alone with Zach in the main room of the cabin. He was building up the fire in the stove, his movements practiced and efficient. "That room," she said quietly, not wanting to wake Sarah. "You were building it when you came to town that Sunday, weren't you? That's why you had extra supplies." Zach straightened, turning to face her with a slightly sheepish expression. "Yes, I started it after I brought you to town. Thought maybe, well, that you might visit someday, that it would be good to have more space." The admission touched her deeply. Even then, just days after meeting her, he had been thinking ahead, making space in his life and home for possibilities. "It seems we're taking advantage of your foresight sooner than expected," she said with a small smile. Zach crossed to where she stood, taking her hands in his as he had done that night in the Wrights' parlor. "Madeline, I want you to know something. Whatever happens with your brother-in-law, however this situation resolves, my feelings for you and Sarah haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger." Madeline looked up at him, drawing strength from the steady certainty in his eyes. "Mine too," she admitted softly. "I was so afraid when Mrs. Peterson came with the news about Victor. Not just for myself or even for Sarah, but because I thought we might lose what we've been building together." "Not a chance," Zach said firmly. "I'm not that easy to get rid of." His expression softened. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next steps." He bent to brush a kiss against her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. As she retired to his room, surrounded by the faint scent of him in the bedding, Madeline found herself thinking that despite the fear and uncertainty, there was nowhere else she would rather be than here, under Zach Flynn's protection, with the promise of a future together still shimmering on the horizon. The next few days settled into an unexpected pattern of domestic tranquility, despite the circumstances that had brought them to the ranch. Zach continued his regular work with the cattle, while Madeline and Rebecca maintained the household and cared for Sarah. They established a routine that felt surprisingly natural, as if they had been living this way for months rather than days. On the third afternoon, Daniel rode out to the ranch with news. Victor Landon was still in Humboldt, growing increasingly frustrated and aggressive in his inquiries. He had begun offering money for information about Madeline and Sarah, and a few of the less reputable elements in town were taking an interest. "It might be best if you all stay out here a while longer," Daniel advised gravely. "At least until Sheriff Donovan returns from his trip to Cheyenne. He'll be back next week, and he's a fair man. Once we explain the situation, he'll ensure this Landon fellow doesn't cause trouble." The news cast a shadow over their temporary idyll. That evening, after Daniel had returned to town and Sarah and Rebecca were asleep, Madeline found Zach on the front porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. "You're worried," she observed, joining him on the rough-hewn bench he had built beside the door. "Concerned," he corrected gently. "There's a difference. What are you concerned about then?" Zach was silent for a long moment before answering. "That man came a long way to find you. That suggests a level of determination that won't be easily discouraged." "You think he won't give up," Madeline said, voicing the fear that had been growing in her own mind. "I think he might need more convincing than just not finding you in town," Zach replied carefully, "and I'm trying to figure out what that might look like." They sat in thoughtful silence, the night sounds of the prairie surrounding them, crickets, the occasional call of a night bird, the soft nickering of horses in the corral. Finally, Zach turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Madeline, I had planned to wait longer for this. To give you more time to court you properly the way you deserve, but circumstances being what they are." He took a deep breath. "I love you, and Sarah, I want you both in my life permanently. I'm asking you to marry me." Though she had begun to hope for this, the actual proposal still took her breath away. "Zach, not just because of Landon," he hastened to add. "I've known since that day I found you in the grass that there was something special about you, about us. This situation has just made me realize there's no sense in waiting to build a life I already know I want." Madeline's heart felt too full for her chest, joy and fear and hope all tangled together. "Are you sure? A ready-made family is a lot to take on." "I've never been more sure of anything," Zach said firmly. "I love Sarah as if she were my own already, and I love you in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. If you'll have me, I want to be your husband and Sarah's father in every way that matters." Tears sprang to Madeline's eyes, but they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Zach." His smile in that moment was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his face with pure joy. He gathered her in his arms, his kiss deeper and more passionate than their previous ones, a promise of the life they would build together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Zach pressed his forehead to hers. "If we're married," he said softly, "Landon's claims will hold even less weight. A woman has a right to remarry after being widowed, and as your husband, I would have legal standing to protect both you and Sarah." "Is that why you asked?" Madeline teased gently, though she knew the answer already. Zach shook his head, his expression serious again. "No, it's just an additional benefit. I asked because I can't imagine my life without you two anymore, because this cabin feels like a home when you're in it. Because I want to watch Sarah grow up and call me Papa. Because I want to wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my life." His words, so direct and heartfelt, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I love you, Zachariah Flynn, and I love you, Madeline Landon, soon to be Madeline Flynn, if I have anything to say about it." The next morning, they shared their news with Rebecca, who responded with delighted but unsurprised congratulations. "I've been watching you two dance around this for months," she said with a grin. "It's about time you made it official." They decided that Daniel would arrange for Reverend Harper to ride out to the ranch the following Sunday to perform a simple ceremony. It would be just the five of them: Zach, Madeline, Sarah, and the Wrights as witnesses. Later, when the situation with Victor was resolved, they could have a proper celebration in town if they wished. The days leading up to Sunday passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Madeline found herself looking at the cabin with new eyes, not as a temporary refuge, but as her future home. She and Rebecca cleaned and organized, while Zach, when not tending to his cattle, made small improvements he'd apparently been planning for some time. Shelves in the kitchen, a rocking chair for the porch, a proper bed frame for the new room. On Saturday afternoon, Daniel arrived with Reverend Harper a day earlier than expected, their expressions grave. "What's wrong?" Zach asked immediately, meeting them in the yard. "Landon's getting impatient," Daniel replied in a low voice. "He's been drinking heavily at the saloon, making threats. Says he knows his sister-in-law is in the area and he'll find her with or without help." Reverend Harper, a dignified man in his 50s with kind eyes and a serious demeanor, nodded in confirmation. "I thought it prudent to come out today rather than wait." "If you still wish to proceed with the ceremony." "More than ever," Zach said firmly, glancing back at the cabin where Madeline stood in the doorway, Sarah on her hip. "If you're ready, Madeline," she nodded, her resolve strengthening. "Yes, right now." And so, on a sunny Saturday afternoon in June 1876, Madeline Landon became Madeline Flynn in a simple ceremony in the front room of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Sarah, dressed in her best gown and blissfully unaware of the significance of the occasion, babbled happily in Rebecca's arms as her mother and Zach exchanged vows. "I, Zachariah James Flynn, take thee, Madeline Elizabeth, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Zach's voice was steady and sure, his eyes never leaving hers as he spoke the traditional words. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it was her turn, Madeline's voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her words were no less sincere. "I, Madeline Elizabeth Landon, take thee, Zachariah James, to be my lawfully wedded husband. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." They exchanged simple gold bands that Daniel had brought from town, Zach having sent measurements and money with him days earlier, already planning for this moment. When Reverend Harper pronounced them husband and wife, Zach's kiss was brief but tender, mindful of their audience but leaving no doubt of his feelings. Afterward, they shared a celebratory meal that Rebecca had prepared with a small cake as a surprise. Sarah, allowed a tiny taste of frosting, showed her approval by demanding more with enthusiastic gestures and babbling. "She approves of the marriage," Daniel joked, making them all laugh. Later, after the rites and reverend, Harper had departed for town, the minister promising to return on Wednesday to check on them. Zach and Madeline found themselves truly alone as husband and wife for the first time. Sarah had been put to bed in her makeshift crib in what was now officially her room, the addition Zach had been building when Madeline first arrived in Humboldt. Standing in the main room of the cabin, they regarded each other somewhat shyly, the reality of their new status settling over them. "Wife," Zach said softly, testing the word. "Husband," Madeline replied with a smile that held both nervousness and joy. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Are you happy, Madeline, truly?" "I know this isn't the wedding you might have dreamed of." She stopped his words with a kiss, rising on tiptoe to reach his lips. "It was perfect," she assured him when they parted. "I have you and Sarah is safe, that's all that matters." Zach's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "I'll give you the life you deserve, Madeline, I promise you that. You and Sarah both." "We already have it," she whispered, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Right here." That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other in ways both tender and passionate. Their union, a confirmation of the love that had grown between them in the months since that fateful day on the prairie. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Madeline felt a peace she had almost forgotten was possible, the certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man she was meant to love. The next few days passed in a newlywed haze, their happiness barely dimmed by the shadow of Victor Landon's continued presence in Humboldt. They established new routines as a family, with Zach teaching Madeline about the operations of the ranch, and Madeline bringing her own skills to their shared home. Sarah thrived in the open air and sunshine, her crawling growing more proficient by the day, her personality blossoming with the security of two loving parents. True to his word, Reverend Harper returned on Wednesday, bringing news that Sheriff Donovan had returned to Humboldt earlier than expected. The sheriff had been briefed on the situation and had already had a conversation with Victor Landon. The sheriff made it clear that in Wyoming Territory, a widow has every right to remarry, and that any claims Landon might have had in Pennsylvania hold no weight here, the minister reported. He also mentioned that harassment of local citizens is taken very seriously. "How did Landon respond?" Zach asked, his arm protectively around Madeline's shoulders as they sat at the kitchen table. Reverend Harper's expression was grim. Not well, I'm afraid. He was incensed. Claimed he was being lied to, that Madeline couldn't possibly have remarried so quickly. The sheriff suggested he could see the marriage certificate if he doubted its legitimacy. The minister paused. That's when Landon made threats, said he wouldn't leave without what was rightfully his. Madeline felt a chill despite the summer warmth. What happened then? Sheriff Donovan locked him up to cool off, Reverend Harper replied. He's still in the jail as of this morning. But he can't hold him indefinitely without charges, and so far, Landon has only made threats, not actually done anything illegal. Zach's jaw tightened. So he'll be released eventually. Yes, though the sheriff plans to have a serious talk with him before that happens. Make it clear that any trouble will result in more than just a night in jail. After the minister left, Zach and Madeline discussed their options. They could remain at the ranch, isolated but secure. They could leave the area entirely, start over somewhere else. Or they could face Victor directly with the law and the community on their side. I'm tired of running, Madeline said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. This is our home now. I won't be driven from it by fear. Zach studied her face, pride evident in his expression. Then we face him. Together, but we do it smart, and we do it safe. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next day, Daniel rode out to the ranch with news that Victor Landon had been released from jail and had immediately gone to the saloon. Sheriff Donovan was watching him, but so far he had done nothing more threatening than drink and glower. The sheriff thinks it might be best if you both came to town, Daniel reported. Show a united front, make it clear to Landon that you're legally married and there's nothing he can do about it. He's hoping that seeing it for himself might convince Landon to give up and go home. Zach and Madeline exchanged a look, silently communicating in the way they had already developed in their short time together. Finally, Zach nodded. We'll come, but Sarah stays here with Rebecca. Madeline started to protest, then reconsidered. Though it pained her to be separated from her daughter, even briefly, Sarah's safety had to come first. If confronting Victor became ugly, it was better that the baby wasn't present. They rode into town the following morning, Zach and Madeline in the wagon with Daniel on horseback beside them. Madeline wore her wedding ring prominently and carried the marriage certificate in her reticule. She had dressed with special care in her best dress, a pale blue cotton that Rebecca had helped her alter to fit better with her hair neatly arranged. If she was to face her past, she would do so looking every inch the respected wife of a local rancher. Humboldt seemed unusually quiet as they approached, though Madeline quickly realized it was not a lack of people but a watchfulness that pervaded the town. Word had spread about the situation, and the citizens of Humboldt had chosen sides. Their side, judging by the nods and greetings directed toward them as they made their way down the main street, Sheriff Donovan met them outside his office. A tall man with a graying mustache and the weathered look of someone who had seen much but remained unimpressed by most of it. Mrs. Flynn, Mr. Flynn, he greeted them formally. Glad you could come in. Landon's over at the hotel taking his breakfast. Thought we might go over there, make the introductions official-like. Is he armed? Zach asked bluntly. He brought a fancy pistol with him from back east, the sheriff replied. I've got it locked in my desk drawer, told him he could have it back when he's leaving town. Some of the tension left Zach's shoulders, though his expression remained vigilant. All right then, let's get this over with. The dining room of the hotel fell silent as they entered, all eyes turning to the newcomers. Victor Landon was easy to spot, a well-dressed man in his early 40s, with the same dark hair as Thomas had, though his face was harder, with lines of dissipation around the eyes and mouth. He looked up from his meal, his expression shifting from annoyance to shocked recognition as he spotted Madeline. You, he said, rising to his feet. Finally decided to stop hiding, did you? Madeline felt Zach stiffen beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. This was her battle, at least to begin. Hello, Victor, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. I understand you've been looking for me. Victor's gaze flicked to Zach, then back to Madeline. Who's this, your latest protector? Didn't take you long to find a replacement for Thomas, did it? The intended insult rolled off her, the months of growth and healing she had experienced since leaving Pennsylvania having made her stronger than Victor could know. This is my husband, Zachariah Flynn. We were married last Saturday by Reverend Harper with witnesses present. It was all completely legal. Victor's face darkened with anger. You had no right, she had every right, Sheriff Donovan interrupted, his voice like steel wrapped in cotton. Mrs. Flynn was a widow for over 8 months before her marriage to Mr. Flynn. In the eyes of the law, both territorial and federal, their union is entirely legitimate. Thomas's property, Victor began, but Zach cut him off. Belongs to his widow, now my wife, he said firmly. Whatever claims you think you have, Mr. Landon, they don't apply here. Madeline and Sarah are my family now, legally and in every other way that matters. Victor's eyes narrowed. Sarah, so the brat is still alive. The crude reference to her daughter ignited a protective fury in Madeline. My daughter is thriving, no thanks to you, and she will continue to do so as Zachariah Flynn's daughter with his name and his protection. This isn't over, Victor snarled, but the defeat in his eyes belied his words. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, with no legal standing and no sympathy from anyone in the room. It is over, Sheriff Donovan stated flatly. The stage leaves for Cheyenne tomorrow morning. I suggest you be on it. In the meantime, you'll stay away from the Flynns and anyone connected to them. Is that clear? For a moment, it seemed Victor might continue to argue, but something in the sheriff's steady gaze, or perhaps in Zach's equally unwavering one, made him reconsider. He sat back down, muttering, "We'll see about that," but they all knew it was over. Victor had lost. As they left the hotel, Madeline felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had almost forgotten what it was like to stand straight. Zach's arm around her waist was solid and reassuring, and the nods of approval from townspeople they passed reinforced the sense that they were not alone, that they had a community standing with them. The next day, Sheriff Donovan personally witnessed Victor Landon boarding the stage to Cheyenne, handing him his pistol only after he was seated inside. "Don't come back, Landon," were his parting words as the stage pulled away. "You're not welcome in Humboldt." With the threat finally gone, Madeline, Zach, and Sarah settled into their life together at the Broken Arrow Ranch. The transition was not without its challenges. Madeline had much to learn about ranch life, and Zach was adjusting to being not just a husband but a father, but their love for each other, and for Sarah made every obstacle surmountable. By the time autumn painted the surrounding countryside in golds and reds, they had established routines that worked for their small family. Zach had built a proper crib for Sarah and had begun work on a larger addition to the cabin that would eventually be her bedroom. Madeline had planted a vegetable garden and learned to manage the household accounts, proving herself as capable a partner in the ranching business as she was a wife and mother. Sarah took her first steps just after her first birthday, toddling determinedly from Madeline's outstretched hands to Zach's waiting arms, her face alight with triumph. That night, as they put her to bed together, Zach said softly, "I'd like to adopt her officially, if you agree. Make her legally my daughter in name as well as heart." Tears of happiness filled Madeline's eyes. "I think that would be wonderful. She already thinks of you as her father. And I think of her as my daughter," Zach replied simply. "I can't imagine loving a child of my own blood any more than I love her." The adoption was formalized that winter, another piece of their family firmly secured by law and love. Sarah became Sarah Elizabeth Flynn, daughter of Zachariah and Madeline Flynn, her future as protected as her parents could make it. As spring bloomed across the prairie once more, bringing new life to the land, Madeline discovered she was carrying new life within her as well. When she shared the news with Zach, his joy was boundless. "A baby," he whispered, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Sarah will have a brother or sister," Madeline said, smiling through happy tears. "A family bigger than I ever dared hope for." Their son, James Thomas Flynn, was born on a crisp November morning in 1877, with Rebecca serving as midwife and Sarah, now a chattering toddler of nearly 2, supervised by Daniel in the main room of the cabin. He had Zach's blue eyes and a head full of dark hair, and from his first lusty cry, it was clear he had inherited his father's strong constitution. Watching Zach hold their newborn son, his expression a mixture of wonder and fierce love, Madeline felt her heart might burst with happiness. From that moment of utter desperation in the tall grass, with Sarah crying from hunger and her own strength all but gone, to this a home, a husband who adored her, 2 healthy children, and a future full of promise. It was more than she had ever believed possible in those dark days after Thomas's death. "What are you thinking?" Zach asked softly, looking up from the baby to find her watching him. "That I'm grateful," she replied simply. "For that day you found us, for your kindness, for your love." Zach's smile was tender as he moved to sit beside her on the bed, their son cradled in one arm while his other went around her shoulders. "I'm the grateful one," he said. "You gave me a family, Madeline, a reason beyond just surviving. You and Sarah, and now, James, you're everything to me." As if on cue, the door to the bedroom opened a crack and Sarah's small face appeared. "Mama, Papa," she asked hesitantly, having been told she needed to wait to see the baby. "Come in, sweetheart," Madeline called, holding out her hand. "Come meet your brother." Sarah approached the bed, her eyes wide with curiosity as she climbed up beside Madeline. "Baby?" she asked, pointing to the bundle in Zach's arms. "Yes, this is James, your little brother," Zach confirmed, lowering the baby so she could see him better. "You're a big sister now." Sarah studied the infant with solemn intensity before declaring, "My baby," with a decided nod. Zach and Madeline exchanged amused glances over her head. "Well, he's all of ours," Madeline corrected gently. "Just like you belong to all of us too." "Family," Sarah said, one of her newest words pronounced with careful precision. "That's right," Zach agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "We're a family." As they sat together on the bed, Zach with baby James, Madeline with her arm around Sarah, the 4 of them connected in a circle of love and belonging. Madeline thought of how far they had come from that moment of desperation in the tall grass. How a simple act of kindness, a cowboy taking off his coat to pick up a crying baby, had set in motion a journey that led to this moment of perfect contentment. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, coating the Wyoming landscape in pristine white. But inside the cabin of the Broken Arrow Ranch, warmth and love banished any chill, wrapping the Flynn family in a cocoon of happiness that would sustain them through whatever challenges the future might bring. And in the years that followed, as their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Emma Rose, in 1879, as the Broken Arrow Ranch prospered under their joint management, as Sarah grew into a confident young woman with her mother's determination and her adoptive father's kindness, as James and Emma followed their own paths while always returning to the place that was home, Madeline and Zach never forgot how their story began. Sometimes, on summer evenings when they sat together on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Zach would take Madeline's hand and whisper, "Best decision I ever made, stopping my horse that day." And Madeline, her heart still full to bursting with gratitude and love, would squeeze his hand and reply, "Best miracle I ever received, having you find us." For that was what it had been, a miracle born of desperation and kindness, a chance encounter that had changed the course of their lives forever. A cowboy, a woman, a hungry baby in the grass. A beginning that neither could have anticipated, leading to a life neither would have dared to dream possible. A love story written across the vast canvas of the Wyoming wilderness, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, hope could take root and flourish into something beautiful and enduring.